we're going to talk about band history from about 1900 to about 1960. So last century, that time period. One of the things I wanted to talk a little bit more about, because we have quite a bit of information about Shabashkum, who was of the Bullhead clan and signed the treaty and negotiated the Treaty of 1855 establishing the reservation. But the other person who was here at Mille Lacs, and his name was Menominikeshi, or rice maker, and he was also considered a leader and at Mille Lacs here. And people talked about that Shabashkin was on the north and west side of the Mille Lacs Lake, and he was on the south and east side of the Mille Lacs Lake. And he was pretty famous at the time. He originally moved to Mille Lacs in the 1830s, and they had a measles epidemic along the St. Croix River and near where the Snake River enters the river. His son Mazumane, who we talked about, moved with the band when they came to Mille Lacs, and his rice maker's daughter married Kegadushe. He was the Keg family is a result of the Kegadushes. Another one married a brother of Kegadushe, same day. But I was looking through an article about annuity payments at Mille Lacs, and they sent soldiers up with the money they distributed. And one of the interesting things in the article that was written about was they said that rice maker, everybody who got an annuity payment reserved 50 cents off of their payment, which in 1860s was a fair amount of money. And that was all given to rice maker, and he held that money. And then as emergencies arose during the year, he would take some of that money and resolve it. You know, if somebody was out of food or their house burnt down or whatever. And everybody agreed that that was how it would work. And so he was pretty well trusted, and they said he was really stingy. And that's why he was able to, people trusted him with their money. One of the things that happened was in 1862, Dole allegedly wrote a letter to him saying that he was, basically it says, the bearer of this rice maker is a good and influential chief of Mille Lacs Indians and one of the first to give supports to white in the present Chippewa conflict. That was the 1862 conflict. And so this letter was allegedly written and given to rice maker. And what was interesting was there was questions about, well, what did that mean? Really, was there a letter? You know, because that was in 1862, and later times, there wasn't, you know, the stuff we have today, copying machines and all this to identify it. But I found an article in the Princeton paper. This was about 1914. So it was a substantial time after when this letter was written in 1862. And it said William Neely recently had placed in his care for safekeeping by Miigwech, sub-chief of Mille Lacs, locally known as Keg, who was baking potatoes. But anyway, so this letter existed in 1914 and was given to this guy down in Princeton. And I spent a little time trying to find out whatever happened to him. where he went, and if that letter still exists somewhere. The letter was, it went on to say that the letter was embellished with a red seal and various color of ribbons that documented that letter from Dole in 1862. So somebody wants a little research project to start looking up this fellow's name and looking to see if there's some record of what he did with that letter. I did find out he was pretty big in the Episcopalian church, and so maybe it got put in the church records for safekeeping. I don't know. Let me go back there. Mizumane also received a similar letter. So both him and, it was kind of interesting that Dole gave a letter to these two individuals, and that seemed to be the extent of his letter writing at that time. And this was kind of something that tribal people asked the United States government to do back in that time period, was to give them a letter verifying their good conduct or the whatever about them. And that was something that was done. Now what I thought we would do is talk a little bit about the Chippewa, the Mississippi reservations, to describe a little bit about them, how they were created, what conditions existed with them, and kind of bring it up more to a contemporary. But to go through each of the 6 reservations of the Chippewa and Mississippi so that you can kind of see what happened to them. At Mille Lacs, of course, there was Shabashkin and Menominee. They signed the Treaty of 1855. Basically, they became exempt under the removal of the 1863 and 64 treaties. They signed the treaty in 1867 establishing the Whitehorse Reservation. When the Nelson Act hearings came, and there was one here at Mille Lacs in October of 1889, and where that occurred was just before you get to Garrison. There's that old resort, one that burnt down just recently, and then there's that old, I think it's called Pike Point resort there. That's where this negotiation with the Nelson Act occurred, according to some of the elders here at Mille Lacs. At that time, Shabashkin transferred the leadership to Wawiyakami. And Shabashkin always said that he was just holding the leadership until someone grew up to take that over. He never said who that was. But some of the history leads everyone to believe that Wawiyakami was the guy that was supposed to take over the leadership. And Wawiyakami was referred to by elders here as Old Earth. And basically the Earth families were connected to Wawiyakami. And ultimately Mille Lacs refused to remove from the reservation and eventually became one of the 6 members of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and today are the present successor in interest in the original band of 1855. And through the treaty, the boundaries were described. One thing that was never really clearly described was the islands. The treaty said it's those 4 partial townships. This square, that's a 6-mile square, so it's 6 miles on each side. So this is the boundary of the reservation. each one of these are 6 miles. So it's basically 18 miles across the south end of the Mille Lacs Reservation. This is Morrison County over here, and I think this is Kennebec County here. So it's all of that south end of Mille Lacs. And then up this point, if you go up 169, right where you see Crow Wing County or Mille Lacs County sign, that's right there. So that gives you an idea about the size of the reservation. Next reservation of the Chippewa, the Mississippi, was Sandy Lake. And again, they created the reservation in 1855. That we done, or Returning Echo was the leader. The Treaty of 1863 didn't address Sandy Lake, but then in 1864 they wrote almost identical treaty. Hole in the Day went out to Washington, D.C. with Musquates, who was the leader at Sandy Lake at that time, and that treaty identifies that Sandy Lake shall not be removed. And so Sandy Lake also had a non-removable clause through treaty. The result of all that was there was questions about what the 1863 treaty said versus the 1864 treaty, and who was agreeing to what. But I think those two treaties have to be read together, both of them, because they're both dealing with the same thing, and one wouldn't have been written without the other. I mean, it made no sense to say that Sandy Lake shall not be removed if Mille Lacs was supposed to be removed. You know? So anyway, I believe those two should be read together and understood that way. One of the interesting things about Sandy Lake was there's really no discussion about the cutting of the pine off of Sandy Lake Reservation. And it was cut, it was probably cut very early because it was right on the Mississippi River, so they could float those logs down. And down the Mississippi River to wherever they had a sawmill. But Sandy Lake, certainly the logs were cut off of Sandy Lake. And in the Nelson Act, they never conducted a negotiations at Sandy Lake. The closest they got was White Oak Point, where there was some discussion that Sandy Lake people were at White Oak Point, but I don't know if that's correct. So Sandy Lake kind of just sat there. And ultimately, there was a piece of trust land established on the north end of that big Sandy Lake where the cemetery is up there. And that was established for the Ojibwe that lived in that area. And it was an executive order establishment of tract of land. Initially, at that time, Sandy Lake was connected to Fond du Lac. So if they needed services or action, Fond du Lac acted as that body. But then in 1934, with the creation of Minnesota Chippewa tribe, Sandy Lake got placed under Mille Lacs, and I hear just recently the Minnesota Chippewa tribe made a motion to explore recognizing Sandy Lake Reservation.
Support efforts.
Yeah, so that's something that's going on. Sorry, that's kind of pleasant. But it basically, the reservation covered, this is Sandy Lake, so it went about here's the Mississippi River, and here is the dam at Sandy Lake. So it's all this land over here, 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 and here, and back up again. Rice Lake, according to this map, is down here, and that's where the Rice Lake Reservation was established, or East Lake, as sometimes it's referred to today. There was a small, again, these are 6 miles square. So the reservation at Sandy Lake is maybe 3 miles wide and maybe 6 miles long, maybe a little more than that. So the Sandy Lake Reservation was fairly big. And again, like I said, with the negotiations under the Nelson Act, Sandy Lake wasn't included in that. And that recent settlement of the Nelson Act for on-reservation timber cutting, you know, there was Leech Lake and the big dispute. Sandy Lake wasn't included in that either. So if you look through those, there's never been compensation for the timber taken off of Sandy Lake, or the taking of the lands either. Rice Lake Reservation, again, was established at the same time. It was located on the Rice Lake, it was called. There are 2 maps at the time, so we're talking about 1855. And there were 2 maps. One map identifies it as Rice Lake, and another map, written by a different map maker, identifies it as Dodge Lake, after Governor Dodge. If they would have used the other map, the Rice Lake Band would have probably been called the Dodge Lake Band, because that's how they, you know, whatever body of water was recognized, that's how they probably became part of it. The land base consisted of 320 acres. That's basically a very small piece of land. It's ½ mile long, wide, and 1 mile long. On the north end of the lake and the islands in the lake were included as part of the Rice Lake Reservation. That 320 acres of land was divided up. Some of the hobbits had land there and different people had land, 40-acre parcels. And then Aiken County taxed that land and tax forfeited the land. They held the title to it. And then when the United States Biological Survey, which came out of the Migratory Bird Act of 1915, and they established the refuge at Rice Lake, the Aiken County transferred that tax forfeited land to the Biological Survey, even though the tribal people were still living there. And then the Biological Survey moved those people out. And I don't know if you remember any discussions about, George Abbott used to talk about that, about how his father got moved out by Biological Survey without compensation. And that's what was going on there, at least from that standpoint. I think what should be looked at, there's a case called the Zasoff case at White Earth. That was actually George Abbott's grandfather who had an allotment. And that brought about the whole White Earth Land Claims Act, because it found that it was illegal to tax those lands and tax forfeit tribally owned allotments. And so that would be another big thing to look at, was whether or not the Aiken County had legitimate reason to tax forfeit that land within that Rice Lake Reservation boundary. Gull Lake Reservation, Hole in the Day was the leader. There was also a secondary leader. He was called Bad Boy, but he really wasn't a bad boy. He was pretty famous, and he really became involved in the 1862 conflict, trying to stop attacks and notify people at the Fort Ripley and those types of things. Hole in the Day was assassinated in 1868, and many of the Ojibwe from Gull Lake moved to White Earth. Hole in the Day at the time was threatening anyone that tried, any Ojibwe that tried to move to White Earth, that he would shoot them. And one of the leaders, White Cloud, he took about 300 people and took off, and he said basically that he was a warrior too, and if Hole in the Day wanted to do something, he was there to, he would fight too. So the guy took these people and they moved to White Earth out of Gull Lake. Some of the people stayed. The Warren family had a section of land on the White Earth, or on Gull Lake Reservation. And then in 2019, a state court judge ruled that basically a White Earth Band member who was fishing up there and was cited by the state could not be fined because it was in the boundaries of the Gull Lake Reservation, which is kind of initial acknowledgement of that. And here's the boundaries of Gull Lake Reservation. Again, those squares are 6 miles, so it's fairly large. You can see where Brainerd is right there. This is the Mississippi River. Here's the Crow Wing River. Here's the Gull Lake River, and here's Gull Lake. Just for your interest or information, right here is where Hole in the Day put all the government employees that he captured out of Leech Lake Agency and settlers from Otter Tail Lake over. They were all put in a stockade right here in this area right here, which was kind of an interesting place to place someone because you have all these bodies of water around them, so they can't really go anywhere. But if you were in Brainerd and you crossed on Highway 210 and you crossed the Mississippi River, as soon as you crossed into the Mississippi River, you're in Gull Lake Reservation, external boundaries of Gull Lake Reservation. So all of Baxter, all of 371, College, all of that's actually on the historical Gull Lake Reservation. And that's something I just realized not too many years ago about how that all laid out there. The second reservation, this one right here, that's the Rabbit Lake Reservation, and Crosby is right here. There was big ore pits here. Rabbit Lake was up in here, and that's the Rabbit Lake Reservation. Rabbit Lake was established in 1855. There was a leader there who was called Crossing Sky. He had went to Washington, D.C. in 1850, 5 years earlier than the reservation being established, and negotiated a sawmill for the Rabbit Lake Band. And they started cutting lumber and building houses and all that kind of stuff. So he was a pretty progressive guy. He signed a treaty of 1863, and when he returned back to Rabbit Lake, they killed him and 3 other of the leaders that signed the treaty in 1855 because people were upset about that. I always felt that, and there was rumors that everybody who signed the 1863 treaty would be killed. The people were so upset about the removal portions of that. And I always felt that really played into why Hole in the Day was assassinated. Because in 1868, the government was really pushing to move people out of the reservations. Okegama Reservation, that was located up at Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And it was located basically where the rapids was, and there was a dam. And again, that was developed for the lumber industry, and many of the members moved to White Earth under the Nelson Act. And there's where the Okegama Reservation sits in relationship to Grand Rapids. This again is the Mississippi River. This is Okegama Lake. And there was another one. Another leader that worked there was named Junia Money. Worked on there. And then I added a piece, even though there wasn't a reservation, sometimes it's referred to as the Lost Tribe or the Lost Band, Ojibwe or Lake Lena. There was never a reservation established there. But what happened was in 1914, the Mille Lacs Band received $40,000 to buy land, which are referred to as the non-removable homeless Mille Lacs Indians. And this was split. $20,000 was to buy land within the Mille Lacs Reservation boundaries, and $20,000 was used to buy land at the Lake Lena Ojibwe area. So that's how the lands over in Lake Lena or Ojibwe got to be there. They weren't there, those land holdings weren't there until they were bought in 1914. And it also included the land at Danbury. There was across the river in Wisconsin, there was a chunk of land there where tribal people lived. And when St. Croix Band got its federal recognition, St. Croix is a relatively new federally recognized tribe in 1970. The Bureau of Indian Affairs pushed Mille Lacs to relinquish their holdings in the lands in Wisconsin because they said a tribe shouldn't have land in 2 states. And then that land was transferred to the St. Croix Band. I remember Art talking about it, but at the time it didn't make any sense to me where this land came from, what issues were involved with it. But it did seem strange that, you know, if you look at the Navajo, they got land in 4 different states. And there's a number of states that have, or a number of tribes that have land in more than 1 state. So anyway. I broke it. So we've kind of discussed the Chippewa, the Mississippi reservations and where they are, what happened to them. And now I want to talk about kind of more temporary issues relating to the Mille Lacs Reservation, and that's the timber and the land. And as everyone knows, timber was a big industry in Minnesota. The pine on the Mille Lacs Reservation was about 315 million board feet. I know that number doesn't really make kind of any visual sense to you, but it's about 9,000 miles. If you made a sidewalk 6 feet wide, 1 inch thick, you could make one 9,000 miles long with 314 or 315 million board feet of lumber. So think of a sidewalk six feet wide, 9,000 miles long. It's fairly large sidewalk. And so there was a lot of effort to try to get that pine. Trees were 180 feet to the first branch. This general diameter was 5 to 6 feet. And I used to live just behind on Timber Trails Road, and I'd walk back in the woods in the early 70s, and there were still pine stumps out there that were 5 feet across when you measured them. And they'd been cut in about 1900. So there were tremendous trees that we just have no kind of visualization of what that would look like. If you've seen the giant redwoods out in Northern California, it'd be similar to that. Or if you've been to Menominee Reservation, and in Wisconsin, there's some large trees there, but there was significant pine here.
So you said 180 feet to the first branch?
The first branch. Yeah. What they said when you walked under was like a huge umbrella. These huge trees that you walked under. So anyway, the lumber industry was constantly trying to finagle ways to get access to this pine on the reservation. They were also cutting pine every place else too, but they were really interested in getting the pine on the reservation. The other thing that I think was going on was that around Mille Lacs Lake there was pine just similar to what was on the reservation. And that was open for cutting, but in order to get it sawed, they had to float it down the Rum River, which means they had to go through the reservation. And in order to get it to flow down the Rum River, they had to dam the river, which was a problem for the wild rice. And anyway, they'd have to pay the band for the destruction of the wild rice because they were damming up the river. And there were terms and agreements that were made to allow that to happen. And basically $1,000 a year the lumber industry had to pay, which was a very significant amount, $1,000 in the 1880s and so on. So I think that kind of made the lumber industry mad, having to do that, and they figured if they could get rid of the band, they wouldn't have to do that anymore. On the other hand, they used band members to drive the logs, which was a very dangerous job, but so there was this struggle between all of this. But the value of the pine was pretty tremendous, so they were very interested in getting it. The other way lands were taken was by railroads. And when the railroad would build a railroad line, it would get a strip of land 10 miles wide, the full length of their railroad. And the idea was that that land would provide the timber for making the ties and the things for the railroad, and then profit for the railroad company. But J.J. Hill, Burlington Northern Railroad, he was the founder of that, and he got tremendous land grants across the Minnesota and up into the Arrowhead region. In the First World War, he had ended up with the mineral rights up in the Arrowhead region, and the United States government wanted the iron ore from those mineral rights, and he agreed to sell it to the United States, but at twice the price that it was valued at. So he got double the amount of money that it was really worth from the United States government because of the war effort. And then the second requirement was that they had to ship it from like Tower and Ely, where the mining was going on, Babbitt. They had to ship it on his railroad to Duluth. And he charged twice the going rate for shipping it. And I calculated that out, that just on the profit side of it, he was making something like $350 million a year just on the profit side. Not, you know, he'd have made stuff if he'd just sold it at the regular price too, but at the profit side, he was making $350 million a year, and this went on for years. So you can see why the Northwest Foundation has a lot of money. I mean, turn of the century, $350 million was a ton of money. That's, you're talking billions of dollars in today's exchange. Another thing that happened was a guy named D.H. Robbins was hired by Nesbitt, who was part of the lumber conglomerate out of Madison, Wisconsin, to survey the reservation to get, so that they would get the best pine, and know the legal descriptions to pick up the best pine. He was a soldier from the Civil War, and he was given a soldier script, and it's real unclear how he got that, but the soldier script for the land that he was given was right here and across the street where the museum is, this land where the government center is sitting on, and out in front here along 169. That was the script that Robbins got. And that was next to Shabashkin, who had gotten 640 acres. And so there was a conflict there. Initially, Shabashkin put Robbins out on the island at the end of the point here, Rainbow Island, and kept him there all summer until some soldiers from Fort Ripley came up and said that he had a legitimate claim. And Shabashkin kept saying, well, you can't have this, is reservation land only. But somehow he was able to stick with that claim. As that went on, in the 1900s, leadership started to change at Mille Lacs. Shabashkin was very old. I think he passed away in 1897. Ricemaker had passed away. Mizumane had passed away. And so the new people that came in was Wawiekamig, who we talked a little bit about, and Shogijik. That was Mizumane's son. So he was Ricemaker's grandson, Mizumane's son. And that was Mudway's Negwanebi, Magizzi. Magizzi was Shabashkin's son, and a fellow named Googie. Robbins keeps popping up in things. He built where the museum is right now. He built a trading post there and traded with tribal members here, and was in and out of conflict with band members all the time. McKizzy has some interesting things about him. He lived until about 1925, and he built a home out on the end of the point here. And it was next to Shabashkin, who was his father, who had 640 acres that he got through treaty. The government had this plan with treaties that they would give the leader of the band 600 or a section of land. It's unclear as to what that section of land was, in the sense of, was it for the chief? Was it for the individual? How, what was the relationship? Because it was given to them as chief, even though they were an individual. So was it their own land after that, or was it really the chief's land where the chief would live? And that never was clear as to what was going on. But Miigwech built a house out on the end of the point. There's a cemetery out there. And a guy named Olaf Johnson, and I tried to track out who Olaf Johnson was. He was basically tied to the lumber industry syndicate. He was kind of a front guy that they used. And they had him file a homestead claim on Miigwech's property. Once he filed the claim, the Mille Lacs County Sheriff came up and arrested Miigwech for being on Olaf Johnson's property. He put Miigwech in jail in Princeton, and then Miigwech had to promise not to molest Olaf Johnson if they'd leave him out of jail. So finally he agreed that he wouldn't harm Olaf Johnson, and so Johnson got to live in Miigwech's house and garden, had about a 5-acre garden out there, and utilized that. A homestead required 5 years that you had to live on the property. So at the end of 5 years, this would have been in 1897, he was ready to file his homestead claim to get a patent, it was called. And Miigwech worked with Gus Bolio. Bolio was a lawyer. He was part of the Clement Bolio family that originally was at Crow Wing and moved to White Earth. He owned the paper in White Earth. It was called the Tomahawk or the Progress. It was an Indian newspaper and started about 1870. He owned that. The Bureau of Indian Affairs tried to seize it because they said that he couldn't publish a newspaper. Of course, the Bureau lost that because of the idea of freedom of spread of the press in the United States Constitution. But anyway, Gus Bolio worked with them. Now, one of the problems with Gus Bolio, he's also worked with the lumber industry. So there was negatives and positives that people had, but he worked with Miigwech, and they filed a legal action in Mille Lacs County Court before the 5-year term of Olaf Johnson was due. And the Mille Lacs County claiming that this was his land and that he had a priority use for that land, or it was his. And then Miigwech loses in Mille Lacs County Court, and it gets appealed to the General Land Office in St. Cloud. And there's a hearing held in 1898, and the court upholds Miigwech's claim to the land. The General Land Office claim, this was a federal claim, and they uphold it. And then Olaf Johnson appeals it to the Secretary of Interior, and they have another hearing, and it's clear that Miigwech had been on that land, he had built the house, all those types of things, and they deny Olaf Johnson's claim, and Miigwech gets his house back and the land back. And but then by 1907, that land is turned into trust in an allotment for Miigwech. And it's really kind of the first allotment in that sense issued on Mille Lacs Reservation. It was actually the second allotment because they called the land that Sheboshkin got an allotment. The interesting thing was the decision doesn't get filed in Mille Lacs County until 1937. It was issued in 1901. Doesn't get filed until 1937. And as a result of that, here's, just so you can kind of see how this is where the powwow area is right here. And this is Sheboshkin Point. This is about where 169 runs, Highway 169. I guess 69 is in there closer, but this is the 640 acres that Sheboshkin claimed through the Treaty of 1863, I believe. And he got issued this patent in 1867. But this land was supposed to be reserved for Sheboshkin. And here is where Miigwech had his land. One of the efforts we've had is try to get back as much of this land as possible in this original 640 acres. And somehow, I don't know if anybody read The Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage story. If you're interested in kind of allotments and how they were dissolved and taken, it's a good history of that. But Mille Lacs has a similar history of taking these. This ended up somehow, at least they said that Sheboshkin mortgaged it and then didn't pay the mortgage, and it was claimed, and various people got pieces of it. Sherm Holbert's parents got this point. This never stops. Right down here, Arnie Cash, Archie, what's his name? Ray Cash, Dad married Weesug, which was Sheboshkin's daughter, and he got that land in here. Cabbage and all this. So there's all kinds of different things that went on to manipulate land. If you go over to Isle, there's something called Malone Island. Charles Malone, he was a trader. He was also a bootlegger and was killed a whole bunch of tribal people by giving them poison liquor, and then ended up with the island that they were living on. So it follows, you know, exactly what happened with the Osage, with poisoning people and taking their land after they died, and just tremendous injustices. I didn't include this, but anyway, as a result of Miigwech's case, it established that the band members had a right to land on the reservation. Under the Nelson Act, when the band agreed with the Nelson Act, they were each supposed to get 40 acres of land allotted on Mille Lacs Reservation. And 40 acres, and there was about 1,500 band members at that time, that would have been 60,000 acres. They would have allotted, the whole reservation would have been covered by band members. But they refused to allot any land to Mille Lacs members, even though they promised they would do it under the Nelson Act. And as a result of that, they referred to Henry Rice as Rice the Liar, because he had promised that they would get allotments on the reservation. And they didn't. But what the McGizzy case said, that in the possession and occupant use by Indian inhabitants is not unappropriated lands. And that's really kind of a key thing. That if tribal people are living on land, it's not unappropriated land, so it was open to the public land laws. And that case is pretty significant in that it basically, if tribal people were living on lands, that meant that it wasn't unappropriated, it wasn't open land. It had a preemption on it. And where that would have direct implication is the Miigwech land at Cove. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, but there's a claim by the state of Minnesota that it owns that land where Miigwechs live. And Miigwechs lived on that land back when the creation of the Mille Lacs Reservation in 1855, and have been continuous residency there. So it's not unappropriated land. And the reason the state claims it is that it's in section 16, which were set aside for school lands. The lands that were in section 16 and 36 of every township was set aside to fund public schools. And so they claimed that for that, that was section 16. But first of all, it was occupied, so it wasn't subject to that. It was preempted. And the second thing was that the state was compensated for that by the General Land Office with school district lands up in the boundary waters. You know, there's these huge tracts of school district lands up there. So that's an unresolved issue. As a result of this.
Hey, Don, can I interrupt you a second?
Yes.
This is all the same, Don. Anyway, I just wanted to point out to those who are listening to this, Zoom meeting, can you mute your tools or your phone or whatever you're using when someone is talking? Because I can't hear Don. I hear his background.
Okay. Yeah. I hear something too. It must be coming from someone else's who's on the Zoom call. Maybe if somebody could mute their.
That's it.
Yeah. There, whoever did that, good job. Oops, it's back again.
Yeah, that's just plain rude.
You could mute everybody.
Can you mute everybody?
Yeah. I don't think it's.
They're gonna see if they can fix that.
I don't want to mess anything up.
Is it on Zoom?
Yeah.
Someone just has to mute themselves on the phone. Yeah.
Yeah, we still are getting background from someone's phone.
There.
Okay, I think it's good.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. So one of the things that was happening was there was all this question about Mille Lacs Reservation and the status of it. It really wasn't a question. Most people believed that Mille Lacs Reservation had a right to the reservation, but there was instigators out there, particularly in the lumber industry, that were stirring this all up, making it sound like it was something it wasn't. And I think it's something that we can all understand, because today we get all these kinds of things flying around, that fake news and all this stuff. But it was going on back then too. And what was happening was that there were all these homesteaders or immigrants coming into the Mille Lacs Reservation and taking up tribal houses. If tribal people were off doing something, visiting someone, they'd come back and there would be some immigrant in their house. And it got so bad that there was a report written by the Indian Rights Association that stated that, in 1901, that stated that of all the tribes in the United States, Mille Lacs was probably the most unjustly treated because of what has happened to their lands and damages done to them. Part of the result of that was Congress appropriated $40,000 to pay for damages done to Mille Lacs members. And when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came to distribute this $40,000, they went through and found where all these damages occurred, and there's a list of those. And then the second thing that the Bureau tried to do was to say, okay, if we give you this money, you have to move to White Earth. So they used it as a way to try to force band members to move to White Earth. The band refused that logic and said, no, this was for damages. It doesn't have anything to do with us for removing. We were not supposed to be removed. And so that was an ongoing issue. The band kept $10,000 of that money to buy land back within the reservation. And they gave that money to Gus Bolio, who put it into an account. And later, I found a court case where the band sued Gus to get the $10,000 back to buy the land. So it was a question of, well, why didn't he just give them the money? But if he would have given them the money, there would have been no record of it. By allowing this court case and him acknowledging, yes, he had this money, and here it was, there actually became a record of that money being used that way. And so from that standpoint, it was a good idea. There was a tract of land bought in Isle, out about where the community center there is, was that 40-acre tract. And various band members lived on it at the time. Because the timber was cut and not paid for, because the land was taken and not legitimately done, some lawyers, a guy named George Edgerton and a Richardson out of Little Falls, Nathaniel Richardson was the mayor of Little Falls, and his brother was a lawyer, and they led a legal case for Mille Lacs on the taking of the timber off the reservation. And this case was filed in 1907, and the Supreme Court ruled in 1913 that it was the land and the timber were wrongfully taken. But the other thing the Supreme Court ruled was that under the Nelson Act, all of the Chippewa and Minnesota were joined together. So Mille Lacs didn't get this money just itself. It had to be shared with all the other Chippewa and Minnesota. And one of the elders here, George Badowski, used to tell me that Red Lake ended up with $200,000 of the money that Mille Lacs got from settlement of the Nelson Act claims on the reservation for cutting the timber. It also said that half of the lands were had valid legal claims on them, so it kind of it was a double-edged sword kind of thing. The band won the case, but it also lost lots of stuff. It didn't get any land back. It got money compensation, but it didn't get the money. That got divided up amongst all the Chippewa. And so it had both good and bad to it. The aftermath of the Supreme Court case was that in 1914, Congress appropriated, and we talked a little bit about this already, $40,000 to buy land back for the Mille Lacs Band. This became the trust lands that we know of under the name of Mille Lacs Band now. And the land was surveyed into 5-acre tracts. And in 1924 then, I believe there were 284 allotments distributed to Mille Lacs Band members. Those are the band members who remained on the reservation. Rainey Boyd received a 5-acre allotment, George Podolsky, Sam Mitchell, lots of people, even though they were young at the time, received a 5-acre tract. McGizzy didn't receive a 5-acre tract. He claimed that he was okay with his allotment from the earlier case that we, yes.
So does that mean there was 284 people here?
Yep,
That was it?
that was it.
Okay.
That was what was left. The rest moved to White Earth. One of the elders told me that he had moved to White Earth. His name was Fred Jones. And they moved at White Earth by a place called Twin Lakes and Elbow Lake. And he said that so many people moved there and died that there was a cemetery a mile long. We had graves in Mille Lacs members that moved there and died because there was all kinds of disease that happened at Mille Lacs, or at White Earth. The disease made you go blind, one of them. The pandemic that came in 1918 was what killed lots of band members. Fred Jones told me about how they'd sit in their house and look out and see whose houses still had smoke coming out of them in the wintertime. And if they didn't, then they knew everybody was dead in that household. So that was the pandemic of 1918 where this was probably going on. The other thing that happened was that there was blindness, a tremendous amount of blindness that occurred at White Earth. And they identified it as the white flour, or the white flour that people were eating. And now there's some data that indicates that the flour that was used for the commodities and annuity payments was tampered with, and there was some kind of chemical put in it that caused blindness. And because they were the Bureau was trying so hard to remove Mille Lacs people, it refused to provide any annuity payments to Mille Lacs people after about 1890. And so Mille Lacs never got any annuities. They never got any of the blindness. So it was kind of interesting, and what was going on. And these allotments were both here at Mille Lacs and in Lake Lena. I'm not sure why Sandy Lake and Rice Lake weren't included in the $40,000. Maybe it had something to do with the Fond du Lac relationship there. I don't know. And I haven't been able to find out why why the money wasn't split 4 ways or differently. But, and maybe some of it was because they had those lands that were set aside by executive order. I just don't know. The next thing that happened, and this was in the 1910s, band members of by Cove, what had happened was the land development companies filed wrongful ownership or eviction notices for band members in the county and claiming that they had no right to be on their property. And for whatever reason, the bands didn't litigate the issue. And my guess was they probably were never served notice that this was going on. But I did see the notice that the court wrote up, and it listed people like John Razor, John Mink, and one of them was John Doe. And I was thinking, I never heard that name, John Doe, before. And then it dawned on me, it's just a general name for anybody who might be there. But anyway, so the sheriff came up, it arrested people, tied them to trees, then burnt everything up that they had. And McGizzy came and said that they could all move up onto his land up here on the end of the point. One of the non-tribal families that lived along the lake, Shodine, they actually cooked a pot of food and fed everyone as they walked up there. So there was kind of this mix of people who supported tribal people and worked with them, and people who were hateful and doing bad things. And the land development company was DBS Johnson Land Development Company. His wife was the daughter of Weyerhaeuser, so it was all tied to the lumber industry. What we have then is the Depression and the New Deal starting to happen. Up until that time, you know, band leadership was determined by a band process. It was, you know, people decided who would be the leaders from basically their interest as recognition as being a leader, their ability to lead, all those kinds of things played into who was identified as the leaders. And then in 1934, that process changed with something called the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA. And under the IRA, if tribes became an IRA tribe or band, then they had an elected form of council. And that's basically the process that we're using today, that's being used today on the reservation, is out of the IRA process. Originally, the bands in Minnesota and Wisconsin were organized under what was called the Great Chippewa Council. Had a logo, they met annually, they elected a chief or appointed a chief and over the council, and they conducted business that they would help Ojibwe people. That would be legislation and all those kinds of things. In Minnesota, the bands agreed to create the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. Initially, it was organized under Section 17 of the IRA. And there were two sections of the IRA, Section 16 and Section 17. Section 16 was a way that a tribe could reorganize the governmental structure, which the Minnesota Chippewa tribe didn't do. But they did the second part, where they reorganized, or they organized and formed a federal corporation. So originally the Minnesota Chippewa tribe was created created a federal corporation. In 1939, the membership voted on the constitution for the federal corporation, and that's what generated the Reservation Business Committee, the RBC. It was a business committee. It was called a business committee because it was organized under Section 17 as a business. And they were to conduct business on the reservations. Ed Rogers, who was a Sandy Lake member, he had become a lawyer. He also went to the University of Minnesota, where he went to law school, and played football. He scored the winning touchdown against Michigan in a bowl game. So he was pretty famous at the time, young man. But he became a lawyer, and ultimately he became county attorney in Cass County for years. But he was the one who wrote and generally orchestrated the construction of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Constitution. Later, the Minnesota Chippewa Constitution was amended to include provisions of Section 16. Also, the governmental side of that. And as you know, there's still ongoing discussions about, does the Minnesota Chippewa tribe have authority to do this or that in governance? And it's based upon some of these relationships of which section was formed there. Just an interesting side note, I worked in Alaska with tribal governments in Alaska and remote villages, and most of them formed both IRAs, Section 16 and Section 17 government provisions under the IRA. So they had both in their tribal council authority. They were both corporations and governmental.
So when was it amended?
I think that the amendment was in 1976, where there was a referendum vote on that. And remember, we talked about this land that was purchased from the funds in 1902 of the $40,000, and they bought this tract of land by aisle. And the people living on that land were the Sams, the Bugs, the Hills, and some other people. The county started taxing that land. And by the 1930s, it was tax forfeited, and they were going to move those tribal people off of those lands. And somehow, there was a court case filed to protect that land, saying it couldn't be taxed. And that's when this McGizzy court case shows up in the records in Mille Lacs County. That the tribal people were living on the land, it wasn't unoccupied land and subject to these laws. And the land was given back to the band essentially, and it sat there and people lived on it and had houses there. And when I was commissioner, I came across this land and it wasn't held in trust, which was very strange, because the only way you prevent basically taxing of tribal lands is to have them in trust. And this wasn't in trust. And so it was very strange, and I started looking at it, trying to figure out why wasn't the county taxing this land, because Mille Lacs County was notorious for trying everything it could to make things difficult. And I couldn't figure it out. And then later on, I started looking at this McGizzy case and recognized that when it was recorded in the county was the same time this tax forfeiture was going on. And somehow the state of Minnesota got involved with it and put a stop to the taking of that land. And, but now it's, I don't remember when, but I think that land has been moved into trust now, so it's not an issue anymore, but it was kind of interesting about how certain things interrelate that you don't think are related right away, and then all of a sudden, they're all kind of related.
Did that happen over like on Ojibwe too, where it wasn't in trust and they could have taxed it, but they never,
Right,
Lawrence County never taxed it, but
Right.
they could have?
right, yep, that was at Whitefish, that property at Whitefish. Yeah, and what actually happened there was, I had went down and met with the county assessor, and we had bought that land, and the band really didn't have much money when we bought that land. And so we really didn't have enough money to pay the taxes on it. And so I asked the assessor if they could waive that. And the assessor said, yes. And so it never got taxed, never got put on the tax rolls. And at the time, I argued with him that, you know, this is tribally owned land, you can't really tax it, because if you tax it, you can't really get title to it, because you can't sue the band to get title to it. And he thought about it, and he said, yeah, that makes sense, and so then he just never put it on, never signed a tax to it. So it sat there, and for a number of years, and it was never a tax, and then we moved it into trust, and then it wasn't an issue anymore. But it was very similar. And, but later, when we had the treaty litigation, the opponents went and found him and made him sign an affidavit saying that no, he never did that. It always meant to go back and show where the tax stopped, and, you know, that when, yeah. So, in the 1940s, so in 1939, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe creates these federal corporations, these RBCs, and there was a lot of discussion that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and what they were going to do is they bought grain elevator, one of these farmers' grain elevators, and they were going to process wild rice, harvest wild rice. They were going to do birch bark work and sell craft work, all under these business concepts associated with the IRA. The other thing the IRA did is it appropriated money to IRA tribes to buy land back within the reservations. And so the Minnesota Chippewa tribe got funding, and the first reservation they bought land back was in Grand Portage. And if you look at the lands from the various bands in Minnesota, Chippewa tribe, Grand Portage has almost all of its original reservation lands. And it's all in Grand Portage's name. Now, what was supposed to have happened was that land was supposed to go in the Minnesota Chippewa tribe's name. But it didn't, it went into Grand Portage's name, and there were resolutions back in the 1950s asking Grand Portage to transfer the land back to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and Grand Portage said, no, I don't think we're going to do that. And the next reservation that they bought land back was on Boys Fort. But the Boys Fort land, they did put in the Minnesota Chippewa tribe's name, and so that's why there's this conflict about each reservation owning its own land is still out there and is still kind of boiling underneath some of the turmoil. The second area of requiring lands, and it related to this business development of wild rice production, was the purchasing of wild rice campsites. And the Minnesota Chippewa tribe got legislation appropriating money to buy wild rice campsites for tribal members to camp on these lakes to harvest wild rice that they could sell to this business that they were going to develop. And so parcels of land in the state park down here on Beachy and across, that was a wild rice campsite. On Mallard Lake, there's a wild rice campsite. Minnewawa, there's a wild rice campsite. Sandy Lake, there's a wild rice campsite. So there are various wild rice campsites purchased so that tribal members would have access to these lakes to pick wild rice. The other thing the MCT worked on was that state law. And as most of us know, that in this Minnesota state law, wild rice harvesting within the boundaries of the reservation is authority granted to the reservation. That's not something the state has jurisdiction on in the sense of harvesting of wild rice, and you have to get approval from the reservation. And you have to be a resident of the reservation or a tribal member in order to pick rice within the reservation. So that was another area they worked on. One of the first wild rice commissioners for the state was the chairman of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. They made him the commissioner for wild rice and had the power to designate different things about when to pick rice and all those kinds of things. The first elected chairperson for Mille Lacs' RBC Business Committee was Fred Sam, and that was Doug Sam's father. Now, one of the things that happened with this IRA and this federally recognized corporation was the Bureau of Indian Affairs refused to now listen to leaders, chiefs, and basically saying that any money a reservation was going to receive would go through their business committee. And so the traditional tribal leaders lost power once the reservation business committees were established, because the Bureau wouldn't give them any funds to like allocate out for somebody's house repair or a well or different things that the community might need. And that was transferred to the business committee, that they had to make the request to get the money from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to do these things. And so the traditional leaderships lost power under that scheme. In the 1950s, what we see is that we get House Resolution 108, which calls for the termination of Indian tribes in the United States. That basically there's this move in Congress to terminate federal responsibility to tribes. And under the theory that, oh, they're good, everything's fine, we'll just divide up the assets and everything will be good. And some tribes were initially put in that position, like the Menominee, and the whole thing failed. One of the reasons Menominee was selected was because it had all this timber, and they started logging that as fast as they could, because they had all this nice timber on the reservation that they wanted to get at, even though it was in the 1950s. One really interesting forest management look at the Menominee forest management plan. They've cut 2.5 times the lumber off their reservation and still have their lumber. So it's a prime example of sustainability in lumbering practice. The second thing that was passed was Public Law 280. And Public Law 280 was only applied in certain states, Minnesota was one of them. And what it did was, it transferred federal, and prior to Public Law 280, crimes committed on the reservation were prosecuted in federal court. And sometimes that process didn't work very well, like for example, people that on Mille Lacs that had some criminal charge against them, they were prosecuted in Fergus Falls. So they had to go way over to Fergus Falls to be prosecuted. So that created difficulties in prosecution, getting people there, getting testimony, all these kinds of things. And so there was concerns that there wasn't adequate law enforcement going on, and that by transferring this federal authority to the state, that the state would be able to provide this more efficiently and better results. As we all know, that didn't work out that way. States grabbed jurisdiction, and then, you know, at the weak point here, the county just, if it was two tribal people that were involved in an altercation, they just ignored it. They wouldn't even deal with it. Even though it was, you know, violence or assault or whatever, they wouldn't even do anything about it. If it was a tribal member against a non-tribal member, then they would get involved. But other than that, they ignored it. And so these were problems. Actually, the Minnesota Chippewa tribes supported the Public Law 280 authority being granted to the state of Minnesota at the time. Red Lake refused, and that's why Red Lake was exempted from Public Law 280. And then ultimately retrocession at Boys Fort, because they never got any services from the St. Louis County Sheriff's Department. They retroceded Public Law 280, and they're under federal jurisdiction again. So there are those types of things that went on. And then in the 1960s, what we see with conditions on reservation, there's President Kennedy and Edward Kennedy produced reports about the conditions on reservations. I think ILAB report was a national tragedy and national disgrace. And that really opened up the looking at funding, education, and trying to improve conditions on the reservation. In the 1960s, Sam Yankee was the chairman at Mille Lacs here and did a lot of work with development of housing, some economic activities. They had a sewing plant, and furniture factory. The sewing plant was in Omania, in that metal building there. And then there's still people who probably work sewing plant. Yeah. And then there was a furniture plant that was right at the junction of 27 and 169, where they made furniture and stuff. And that was all sponsored through something called the Mille Lacs Foundation. A guy named Lee Cook, Monty Frunt's dad, ran that foundation.
I remember the chip furniture factory.
Yeah. That would probably been closed by the, somewhere in the 60s, I think this stuff goes down. So anyway, that's kind of the mid-history of the band. I'm thinking the next time will be from the 70s to kind of more current time. If there's questions, I'll try to answer them, otherwise. We'll call it a day.
Yeah, Don,
Yes.
trying to reconstruct track some of the history from, I would say after Fred Sam of some of the chair people and district representatives.
Right.
Is there any, information that you may have or know where to get that information of the people that serve?
There's a couple, there's in the band archives, there's a bunch of resolutions that were in the 50s and 60s. They're all filed under a set of, like a set of minutes that would be recorded annually. And these resolutions then have at the bottom of them who was chairman and vice or secretary treasurer. Usually were signed on the bottom of the resolution. So you can look at those and figure out then from the date of the resolution who was chair at the time. I know Albert Churchill was on the council in the 50s, and at different points. Marge Anderson in her records had a list of all the tribal chairs that she could name. I never saw the list, and I'm not sure who might have that data or information. I know someone was looking at it, and I'm trying to remember who might have those records about. She was trying to write, like personal memory or autobiography about history at Mille Lacs. And so that would be another place to check.
If you could find that out.
There might be, one way might be also there's, at the Minnesota Historical Society, and you can do this online. It's called the digital newspaper. So they have about, I forget, 200 or so Minnesota newspapers online that you can search digitally. So you don't have to look at each one. You can type in things like, chairman of Mille Lacs or elections at Mille Lacs or something like that. And it might have a newspaper article about those. Earlier, if we want earlier histories, the White Earth paper that Gus Bolio owned called the Tomahawk and later was changed to the Progressive, those are all on digital digital format so that you can access them from the internet. And you see a lot of stuff about different things, about elections, and there's a lot of talk about the Great Chippewa Council, but that only goes up into the 30s, and then that paper ended. The Miigwech, I don't know if you remember that, that was the Minnesota Chippewa tribe paper. Betty Blue wrote. There's some of those that have been digitized, but not many as I remember correctly, so that would be another
What's the name of
point.
that paper again?
Miigwech, talking about ourselves.
Quasim.
Yeah,
Okay.
so those would be all kinds of thoughts I'd have about where you might be able to find some of that additional information.
Good.
Okay, anyone else?
I had a question.
Yes.
You talked about the two sections of the IRA.
Yes.
One allowed formation of government, one allowed formation of business.
Yes.
So Minnesota Chippewa tribe was organized under the one that did business.
The what?
Minnesota Chippewa tribe in 34 was organized under the piece of organized business committees.
Right.
Corporations.
Right.
Out of the IRA tribes, did anybody organize under the other one exclusively, or governments?
In Minnesota or everywhere? Oh, I think a bunch of them did throughout the country. I mean, all the Alaska Native tribes did. They formed government structures.
So what happened in Minnesota? Why, folks,
Why did Minnesota not do both 16 and 17?
whoever organized Minnesota Chippewa tribe
Right.
Chose
That was
the
Ed
one-
Rogers.
chose the one for a reason.
Right.
Why was that?
I think, and I don't know this for a fact, and I always wish I would have been able to talk to Ed Rogers, because it would have been fascinating, I think, to listen to what he would have had to say. But where his records went, I don't know. You know, that would be another thing to look for. I think that they probably did section 17 because, you know, the Great Chippewa Council still was comprised of basically traditional leaders.
Uh-huh,
And so it would be like saying,
gotcha.
you guys are gonna lose everything and we're gonna give it to these guys who are elected.
Gotcha,
That probably
that makes sense.
wasn't the front you wanted to take on. And the Bureau probably didn't tell anybody that, well, they were gonna recognize the IRA for funding, whether it was a business side or whether it was a government side.
What was that reference to the section yesterday in the presentation across the street? You remember that? I missed that now. I don't remember why they used that.
Saying something along the lines of, MLCB could file underneath, that was an option to file with. You know how like, you could file like under Minnesota or ban law, then you could file under section 17. That's what they were saying. I don't know how.
I mean, when they filed with the state,
Huh?
when they filed with the state for those licenses?
Yeah, but instead of with the state, under section 17 or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that would be a federal corporation under the IRA. I mean, that's what you'd be filing under. Yeah, there's some value to being a federal corporation. You know,
Maybe that's what they were saying, saying we're a business anyway. That's how they filed because MLCB and a lot of their organizations across the street are organized under state law now.
oh, yeah, see, so you know, you can organize those under state law and, you know, most corporations organize under Delaware state law because the law is so favorable to the corporation. But you can also become a federal corporation, and then those are favorable laws. You know, and I don't know what is required to be a federal corporation in general. Probably it's gotta be multi-jurisdictional, blah, 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 blah. You know, like being operating out of a number of states or something.
Yeah.
But tribes can do it under the IRA.
Yeah, we're just trying to understand some of this.
Yeah. So they're connected.
So even into the 50s, the reason my dad came up and started building that land because those guys were telling him that, remember he was telling him that you're gonna lose your land, you owe a bunch of money on it.
Yep, yep,
Well, we'll take care of that debt for you, just
Right.
sign the land over.
yep,
And that wasn't true.
yep. Well, it was a theory. I mean, that everybody felt that in the 1950s, that under the termination era, that all the lands would be terminated. And what happened at the time was a lot of these allotments was, and at the time, I think Mildred Hill was on the council. They were concerned that people would lose their land, so they talked them into selling it to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And some of it was non-consent sales. In other words, the Lockheed didn't agree, but they did it anyway. They got the Bureau to sign off, and those became non-consent sales, and those non-consent sales then ultimately were transferred. And then I think in the 1980s, there was something called the 2415's land claims. Came out of, I think, the White Earth, the illegal taking of lands, the allotments at White Earth that created Welsa and the whole land issue there. The Congress passed something called the 2015 lands claims, where you could claim the illegal taking of lands from tribal members. And a lot of these non-consent sales were illegal takings. And many of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe transactions between the sale of the allotment to the MCT versus to the individual was through non-consent sales when they could have gotten consent. They just didn't want to do it. And so these lands transferred to the MCT, and so now if you look at a map of this, say this region right here, you'll find, certain allotments, like the Badowskis didn't sell theirs, your dad didn't sell his, but a lot of them did sell theirs. Even though the original lot, these can be found, it's all Minnesota Chippewa tribe now owns it. The 2415s allowed you to file claims, and so the Minnesota Chippewa tribe actually had people down here researching and found that they were legal transfers on these non-consent sales and filed 2415 claims. And those 2415 claims have never been litigated. They're all just sitting there in a file somewhere.
So did those, that McGisley 80 acres and the Shabashkin, did that all get transferred to the band, or how did that work?
Well, Shabashkin's, his, according to the county records, occurred because he signed a mortgage and didn't get the mortgage paid, and the bank, it wasn't a bank, it was private individuals, repossessed the mortgage. Whether that's true or not, whether it's valid or not, I don't know, but some of Shabashkin's children signed off on it. Some of them didn't, like Lisa did, who married Ray Cash's dad. Musquades at Sandy Lake, he got a section of land out in, and he claimed, not in the reservation, but out in the middle of Savannah Portage area, just like it makes no sense how you pick that tract of land out there. It's not on a lake, it's not on a river, it's just a big section of land out in the middle of a huge forest. But guess what happened to his? He defaulted on a mortgage. And that was lost. So there's a lot of stuff that could be looked at, like, were these really trusts, allotments that couldn't be mortgaged? Because if you own an allotment, you can't really mortgage that legally without the United States agreeing to it. And then the United States doesn't necessarily agree to it because they don't want to have any liability. It's kind of like a cosigner on a note, If you co-sign a note and the person that you co-sign for defaults, then it's your bill. And so the United States, doesn't like to co-sign for loans against trust assets. And so, but then how did these happen, that these lands got lost that way? But McGisley's land, that went through airship and got transferred, and then ultimately the Minnesota Chippewa tribe bought it.
So that was a fairly short list of those guys who didn't sell their allotments, huh?
Yep,
Most of them guys sold their
most
allotments.
of the land sold it,
Yeah.
and they sold to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe.
Yeah.
Yep. And the council here actively sought people to do it. And they paid them small amounts of money. They did it basically because they thought the termination was gonna happen, and the only way to protect the land was to keep it in the corporation of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. See, and the corporation would either pay the tax or be non-taxable, non-profit corporation. So I think that's what the thought was, that, you know, public lot 2, or the termination was gonna occur, and Mille Lacs was listed as one of the tribes to terminate. And so it was pretty aggressive, you know, you got I think the guy's name now, communists, you know, the whole,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, McGovern or not McGovern, who was the guy
Here's the guy.
in the.
From Wisconsin?
Wisconsin, who went after the communists.
Went after communists in the 50s, 60s or something?
Yeah, the 50s. They were gonna take over and
Yeah.
accusing everybody of being a communist and then literally destroying them economically, you know, just. But I can't remember the guy's name. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. But, you know, so there was a lot of fever running around, you know. And then if anytime people said anything negative, then you were a communist, and then, you know, and I'm sure tribes were worried that they'd get labeled that way too, not having a recourse.
Okay,
All right,
we're good for now.
okay.
Miigwech. Is anybody on the, some guys who are allowed to be called?
Still on?
Hey, Don, this is Walter St. John again.
Yes,
It was, when you were talking about some of the crossings there at Whiter due to blindness because of the flowers, was there any kind of adjudication or any kind of court cases that was filed against, I don't know if it was the military or the government or both, for those people that suffered that blindness?
yeah, there wasn't any charges, I don't
Sheldon.
believe. It all
Is it
came
Joseph
out in
McCarthy?
something called the Graham Report.
Is it Joseph McCarthy?
Yeah. McCarthy.
That was a
Okay.
congressional investigation at White Earth about who took the land and the timber off of the White Earth Reservation. And it's a 3,000-page report of this congressional investigation in the 1910s. And there's a lot of stuff about Mille Lacs in that report because a lot of Mille Lacs members removed to White Earth, and so they were interviewed. There was one, the guy's name was Amazon Clark, if you read it, and you read his name. Anyway, I saw that on Mille Lacs annuity rolls, Amazon Clark, and I thought, who would have named their child Amazon? Must have been a big guy. Right. Anyway, what happened when I was reading through that Graham report one time was they interviewed him. And I go, wow, here he is. And they asked him what his name meant. He says, oh, it means broken rice. His name wasn't Amazon, it was Amazon.
Oh, okay.
You know, the Ojibwe, but it looked like Amazon the way it was written, you know. But it was, the accent was on the A, and so it was Amazon, the broken rice when you're winnowing. And that was his name, so So it's kind of funny in that sense, but, yeah, so that's, there were copies, I think down in archives here at the band, there is a copy of the Graham report. It's 2 big thick volumes, but it's, this congressional investigation, so they bring in all these different people, ask them things and talk about, their ancestry and what they did and didn't do and how they got the white earth and all these kinds of things because of all the fraudulent stuff that went on at White Earth. I don't know if that helps.
Very interesting, good.
Okay,
Hey, John, it's Marvin Bruno.
yes,
I'm curious about that Miigwech's property out there at that 600, that sector,
yep,
that section.
yep.
Is that in the Savannah Forest State Park?
I don't know. I used to, it's somewhere we have the legal description of that property.
Okay.
It's,
You're talking about the middle of nowhere. There's Bulls Lake, there's Loon Lake out there too.
Right. yeah, it's kind of north and east of that existing, where Skinaways live and stuff up there on the north end.
Yeah, I know well.
Yeah.
That's a big state park up there.
Yeah, so it's right out in the middle of that, and it's not connected to a river or anything. So it was such a strange selection, I thought.
There's a couple of nice lakes out there, though, they're deep.
Ah,
Cove Lake,
yeah,
yeah.
but when I looked at it, I didn't see any lakes around it. But
Oh, okay.
But the thing that was interesting is most sections are 640 acres.
Yeah.
This one was like 740 or something. It was extra large because it was adjusted. When they do the survey and they get the latitude and line and they got an error in their survey, they adjust. So this was a larger than normal section of land. That was the only thing I found interesting about it. But as far as on the map, it looked like there was nothing around it, or no way to get there. But it should be down in archives, maybe the archivist could find that, because we had both Shabashkin's and Miigwech's allotments, they called them, that were issued.
Wow.
Yeah.
Must have been something out there,
Yeah, there had to be that's, and I never tracked it beyond that. Time-wise, it was always an issue, but I did look at, where it was located, and it just seemed so strange that it was not attached to a river or a lake or anything, that just.
Yeah.
Maybe,
He just wanted to get away from everybody else.
right, maybe it was a isolation place to go to just stay away from everybody, I don't know.
Yeah, there you go.
Yep,
I know the feeling.
yeah, yeah,
All right, be wished.
okay, yep, yeah.
Next Friday again?
Checking with the boss, he's nodding yes.
Okay.
All right,
Look forward to it.
okay.
Take
Yep.
care.
All right.